Hi everyone, and welcome to the tutorial series for the procedural park. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the grass, flowers, and foliage. And if you look at the coverage here, is basically the settings for the grass, the flowers, and the foliage. And this should be a relatively short video, which is why I'm including all three as a single video. So right now, we've taken a look at how to spawn the central actors, create our pathways, and go ahead and spawn our props. Now we're going to take a look at grass, flowers, and foliage. And all these three settings are under setup dash foliage, and you can see right here. And the settings are fairly simple. We have an array of potential meshes for each individual category, and we have a number for each individual category. So for the foliage, which in this case can be trees and bushes, by default I'm including a pine model from one of the Epic demos, and I'm including this hill tree model, which is coming from the kite demo. So two types of trees. And then for the grass, I only have one model, which is the field grass coming from the kite demo. And the flowers, I actually have two different models. We have a buttercup and we have a scabious. I think that's how you pronounce it. And that's pretty much it. The grass and the flowers, by the way, have booleans which determine whether these guys can be spawned or not. And you can see that by default, the grass is disabled, right? And what happens here is that so far, every time we come to the park, I'm going to go ahead and update the material here. We have been spawning our park by using a landscape, right? So when you use the landscape, I'm assuming that your landscape will probably have grass already spawned here. So in that case, you don't really need to spawn the grass. So by default, if you remember in one of the previous videos, there's an option here under generation, all the way down, that says show floor. So if you select this, and I'm going to go ahead and move this park up, you can actually see that there is an actual floor that you can spawn for your park. And the floor is literally just a plane with a material of grass, right? So if you show the floor, and here's the floor material, by the way, automatically the park will enable, and you click on set parameters. Notice that automatically spawn grass will be enabled, right, by default. So, which means that because we're assuming you're not using a landscape, you want to spawn your grass as instant static meshes. Otherwise, if you're using a landscape, meaning you want to hide your floor, you probably don't want to spawn the grass. It's as simple as that, right? So if we come here and say we're using a floor, and we just click on spawn grass, we're going to click a few times here, so you can see we're going through the batching process here, because a park of this size, we've calculated that we wanted 60,000 instances. You can see it's done here of grass. Right? And when we hit play, notice that we have grass, right? It's the exact same model, the exact same system. These are instant static meshes that we spawned on our plane. Notice that this is done, oops, and you can see that we have pretty bad performance. And the same thing, if we want to spawn our flowers, we can click on spawn flowers and it'll just spawn it on our plane. And you can see that we have some flowers here. And the same thing if we want to spawn our foliage, it'll just spawn it on our plane. So, and you can see that everything is self-contained inside this blueprint. Notice that everything is a child of our park, which means that everything is just attached to our park BP. This is the way that I've done it for the city demo. So if you open the level for the city, because we are not using a landscape, I'm basically using a plane for the floor, and I'm doing our grass individually as instances. And you can see that it looks pretty good. However, the density, you can see that there's a little strip here. The density is not going to be as good as if you had it spawning on your landscape. So my recommendation, I'm going to go ahead and remove everything. My recommendation is that if you can, use your landscape, obviously, because it's going to give you way nicer results. So in this case, I'm going to hide the floor. I'm going to click on, again, set parameters. And now if I wanted to spawn my grass, notice that I get a little error saying spawn grass is disabled. You could enable it, but in this case, you probably don't want to. And that is pretty much it, right? The only other thing I wanted to show for the foliage is that if you have more than one model here, and the same thing for the flowers, it'll pick a random model and it'll spawn it, right? So in this case, for the foliage, we want to spawn 1500 trees. In this case, I have the pine. Notice the options that we have here for the foliage. You have our collision bounds, our percent chance to spawn, whether we want to apply random scale, random yaw, and which is the min and max scale here, whether we want to align it to the surface, and what is the maximum slope we want to spawn our tree. So we have 100% chance to spawn for the pine, and right now I have 0% chance to spawn for the hill tree. So if you wanted to spawn both, obviously you would change the percent chance, maybe 50% on this guy and 50% on this guy, and now what will happen is if we decide to spawn our trees, then you'll get a mix, as you would expect. So we have a mixture of trees. I always show on the demo one type of tree, but that doesn't mean that you can't mix and match, right? So same principle. In this case, we have both trees. So if you have you know, a bunch of different trees from Speed Tree or Tree It, or you have a marketplace asset with a lot of different variations of the same tree, different colors, materials, whatever, it'll be very easy for you to just add all of the different models here as individual items in your array, and that way you can spawn your trees. One additional thing I want to point out before we close the video is the trace. So notice that we have some collision bounds here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to disable this guy. I'm going to make this 0% chance to spawn, so it's easier to see, and 100 for the pine. If I just try to spawn my foliage, oops. Notice that I'm spawning, and eventually I can only spawn 4, 9, 7. Notice that we have a specific distribution here. So no matter how much I try to spawn, you're still going to have a decent distribution, and that's because we don't want the trees to overlap each other, right? So if you go back to setup general, if you remember from our previous video, and we go under trace details, what we can do here is we can modify the trace that we're using for individual categories, in this case for the foliage, and we can increase it or decrease it. By default, I'm decreasing it by 50 units. But remember, the foliage bounds, as we see here, are, for the pine, 470 by 454. So if I wanted to pack these guys really tight, I could say reduce the trace by 300 units, effectively making the bounds of these guys like 170 and 154. And look what happens now if we spawn trees. I'm gonna go ahead and remove everything and click on spawn foliage. And notice that now we have way more density as we keep on clicking. See that? We have a lot more density in our forest because we decided to reduce the trace size for the individual trees. So keep that in mind, that you have control over how dense you want something to be by using the trace details. And that will work, again, not only for foliage, but you can see that we have something for props. So if you want props to be separate from each other or more closer to each other, you can even do it for grass, even though I don't recommend it. Central actors by default have an additional 10, right? So they're not too close to each other, and even the entrances for the pathways. All right, and that is pretty much it. It should be pretty self-explanatory. Play around with the settings, and now you know how to spawn your grass, your flowers, and your foliage. All right, guys, thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next video.